Apex a bit soon. Stay up. That's it. Out we go. In. Apex as well. Oh, we missed the apex there. Let's go out. Right out the cockpit. Latch out in fourth gear. Third gear. Fourth down. Nearly 5 down. Oh, welcome to another episode of repairs to this poor old Triumph 2500 Mark 1. And what are we going to do today? Well, we're going to put the tail shaft back on. Now, you might remember when I was putting the gearbox together, I couldn't do the rear nut up because there was no way of locking the gearbox up. But now it's in the car, I can use special tool XXIII that bolts to the flange, hits up on the floor of the car, and I can tighten that nut up. Then the tail shaft. Speedo drive, hook up the overdrive properly, inside the car, put the gear stick in and put the inside back together properly before moving on to the main cross member and the front suspension, and on it goes. So let's get on with it. Well, it's time to do this big nut on that's the end of the gearbox. Can't do it with the gearbox out, so need to use this special tool which is a bar of aluminium that I bolt to the flange on the end of the gearbox. And then when it turns, it'll hit on the floor of the car. Well, got a handful of sockets because I'm not getting out from under here again. Oh my goodness, I am going to have to get out from under here again. These are all going to be too small. Now down under here there's the speedo drive, which I'll probably do next, and the wires that work the overdrive, and then after that I'll put the tail shaft on. So let's get on with that. I don't know. Something like this should be as simple as you could possibly imagine, and for the first time ever it doesn't want to cooperate. Well, the time has come to fit the tail shaft. I had to put a new uni joint on the end here. It was a little bit worn. Alright, so let's get down and under and get this thing on. Well, that's the tail shaft on. Let's get on with the next job. Well, it's time for the extractors on. Now, let's get these extractors on. Well, that's the extractors on. They're clearing the power steering pump bracket. So I can get back under now and hook the exhaust up. So let's get on with that. Well, let's get this exhaust on. Now, this is the old exhaust. It's going back on so I can drive it during the testing process and drive it to get a wheel alignment and drive it to an exhaust place because it's getting a new exhaust. So I still have to put it on. So let's get on with that. Luckily it's well, not luckily, I made it that way. It's got like flange fitting, so it's just held on with a couple of bolts. There's one thing I've always hated, and that's those sort of slip together joints on exhaust. Now, I was in a bolt place buying a whole lot of bolts, trying to make it easy for me, and I saw that they had brass nuts sort of thing. So I bought a couple of them to use on the exhaust. The downside is there's some sort of Whitworth headed thing. Luckily I've got a few Whitworth spanners, but I'd rather that wasn't the case. It's time to put this on, which is the subframe. It's a power steering subframe. It's also had some brackets welded onto it to hold the sump guard on. And so let's get on with it. Well, let's get this cross member in. There's some sort of big chunk of steel that goes up here that is a sort of strengthening thing. Well, that's the cross member on. Let's get the lower control arms on. Well, it's time to put the lower control arms on. That's these things. New ball joints in them. New nylethane bushes in them. And I expect these to give me some grief. Let's see what happens. Nice new bolts. Alrighty, it's time to try and get this ball joint on to the suspension, and it's never an easy thing to do by yourself. Well, that's that done. Let's get on with the other side. Now, after that will be the sway bar. But before I put the sway bar on, I need to get the steering rack physically in there. It's not getting bolted in, it's just got to get physically put in there. And then the sway bar. So let's get on with that. Well, here we have the front suspension is in. Lower control arms, ball joints, etc. all on. It's now time to physically get this rack in place. Now normally I would now put the sway bar on, but I've got to get this steering rack in there first. The sway bar will be in the way. But I don't want to put the rack in properly, fully at the moment, because I need to hook up the steering column part of it, and to have the rack to be able to move it around a bit is going to make that easier. But before I can put the rack in there, I need to know where the centre of that rack is, where the wheels will be pointing straight ahead. And there's no real way of saying, okay, that's definitely, there's no mark or anything that tells you that. The only way I can think of to do it is to put it all the way on one lock, wind it all the way the other way to find out how many locks there are, and then divide that in half. Now, I've done this many times, you know, with the dolly and this car when it had manual steering. It never really works. Like, you only got to be one spline out and the steering wheel won't be straight. And in that, you know, that sort of does and doesn't matter. There's a little doohickey on the steering column that turns the blinkers on and off. And you know, if you get too far out, you know, you can take the steering wheel off and center it up again. But if that little doohickey ends up in the wrong spot, your blinkers aren't going to turn off and on. So anyway, so I've turned it all the way one way. I'm going to turn it all the way back to get how many locks there are, and then halve that and come back to what will hopefully be the centre. Now this is a power steering rack, which I haven't had a lot to do with over the years. But it's all been rebuilt, so I'm hoping it's all lubed up in there, because there's bound to be seals and all sorts of stuff. But it'd have to be all lubed up, so turning it around and around shouldn't hurt it. Alright, we're all the way that way. So let's mark it so I know where we are. And let's turn it back the other way. That's one. That's two. That's three. Well, I'm going to call that 3 1/4. Not really. Let's mark that so I can make a guess of it. It's 3 1/5 turns lock to lock, so that's going to be 1 1/2. Now I'm going to have to divide this up, aren't I? Alright, let's go with that. That's no rocket science there, but it'll get us close. Well, you know how I said I was going to put the steering rack in and just sort of sit it there for now while I put the sway bar on? Well, I got carried away. The steering rack is now completely in and completely bolted up. Yeah, here we have the top of the steering rack. Now that rubber joint there, absolute nightmare. Yeah, awful thing. And then getting it onto that part of the rack. Yeah, me and steering racks are not the best of friends. I haven't actually done those two bolts up. I'll have to do that next. Now down underneath, well, the tie rod end of it and the steering rack itself all bolted up, all tight and all ready to go. Of course, there's still the plumbing associated with it and the power steering pump itself, but another job sort of done. Alright, it's time to put sway bar on. Now, my memory of this is that it can be a bit awkward as well. Again, partly that's because the car is jacked up and the suspension is sort of fully drooped down, and it's not the natural place for this to be sitting. So in fact, I think I need to put a jack under it to compress the suspension a bit. We will see, and I'll get on with it. Well, here we have the front sway bar is now fitted and on. It's an aftermarket sway bar, Selby suspension, made probably in the 60s, maybe 70s. It's pretty side of the road stuff. It's where it bolts on here, this sort of setup here is pretty dodgy. But it's been on the car for 30 years, so it's still working, and so who am I to say? Of course, at the moment the suspension's on full sort of droop, if you like, and that's not the natural place that it would normally sit for 90% of its life. And once the suspension comes up, this weird angle we have here would be a bit better. So anyway, that's the front sway bar on the car, and it's now time to move on, probably to the engine bay. Well, that brings us to the end of another episode of repairs to this poor old Triumph 2500 Mark 1. Tune in, same duck time, same duck channel, for more mechanical mayhem on this poor old car. When you'll see me start work on the engine bay. There's some challenges coming up there, so I'll see you then. Bye for now.